All right, so that brings us to part 3 of our seminar on church history, part 3 of 3. Last week we covered the Middle Ages, basically, right? The Crusades and the struggle for power between secular and religious authority, the Great Schism, and on and on. Today we're moving from the Reformation to modern history. So we will start with that obviously important and seminal event, the Reformation, and we're going to have to build up to it with a few minutes worth of info. We don't start in 1517 with Martin Luther, nothing does like that. But the question that starts our thinking off about the Reformation is, are there traditions? Right? We're 1,500 years into church history, so traditions exist. Are there traditions that are not talked about in Scripture, not issues not addressed, or ways of doing things not covered in Scripture, right? If you think about baptism, if you think about communion, there's not a lot of nuts and bolts directions there. Are those traditions an essential part of what it means to be a Christian? And we've got 2 different ways of answering that question that will develop in this time period, with Roman Catholicism saying, yes, the dogmas of the church, the traditions of the church have authority as well, and Protestants, for the most part, saying, no, they do not, or at least not sufficiently to bind us. So let's dig into it. The map shows you where we are going. That is where the majority population will be in 1560. We got a while to go there until we get there. So let's back it up. Remember last time we talked about the power struggle between popes, the papacy, and kings and emperors. Well, within the church there was a power struggle as well, and for many centuries the abbots, the men that ran the monasteries, were some of the most powerful and influential people in the church. But beginning in the 11th century, that's going to change. This church hierarchy, priest, bishop, cardinal, pope, that whole thing in the East ending with patriarchs, that develops fairly early in church history, and then over time it just solidifies and gets defined. By the 11th century, we're switching power back from the monasteries to the bishops after many centuries where it was like that. There are a number of reasons. Number one being that your aristocracy, your kings, your noblemen, are often related to a bishop. A bishop might be his brother-in-law or his nephew or his cousin. And of course, that was part of that investiture controversy we talked about last week. One of the reasons why kings and emperors and other noblemen wanted the power to appoint bishops is because they wanted to put people in those positions that were loyal to them and their family. Where, of course, the papacy had other interests at heart than that. So you have that happening. And as the church grows, as the number of parishes in a diocese grows, as the number of people in it grow, right, the number of priests, the function of a bishop becomes more and more and more administrative, right? Which makes sense. As a company grows, as any organization grows, the executives get more and more bogged down with administrative work and less involved in day-to-day operations. That's just the way it ends up being, because you can't possibly have a hand in it all. So you have bishops that are remote from their flocks. They don't know the people that they are supposedly shepherding. Sometimes bishops don't reside within their diocese, like a congressman living in a different state. There's an issue, right? And sometimes they are children. There are a few instances where like a child, like a minor, was appointed as a bishop because he was the king's nephew, kind of thing. So we're starting to grow a disconnect between the clergy and the laity. And it starts at the top. And of course, we had at the same time period, right, the institution of clerical abstinence. And so that is pushing the laity and the clergy apart as well. So that's our first step in this direction, the gaining of power to the bishops and the papacy, and then the distance between the laity and the clergy. The next issue, before we start getting into things that you're going to recognize as being connected directly to the Reformation, is the Fourth Lateran Council. A lot of Protestants have never heard of it. 1215, so we're a couple centuries before, under Pope Innocent III. This is the council that created the Inquisition, famously, right? The Inquisition is quite famous. You ask people what the Inquisition was, and just about everybody can name it. Some of them from the history of the world. Comedy, musical number about nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, but it has a huge impact. From 1249 to 1257, so in an 8-year period, we have records of 306 people that were penalized by the Inquisition, with 21 of them burned at the stake. So that's quite serious. One of the things that the Lateran Council did, besides setting up the Inquisition, was determine that every Christian beyond child, in other words, every adult, was to receive the Eucharistic elements at least once a year, which at one point that's begging the question, why are we not receiving them more than once a year? We'll return to that later when we get to Jan Hus, after taking confession. Now, on one level, this is a very smart pastoral decision, right? Because you're trying to make sure that everybody is connecting with their parish priest, that everybody is involved within the parish, is involved in the ritual and the life of the church. Another thing that the Lateran Council promulgated was the definition of the Eucharist that becomes known as transubstantiation. They declared that the body and blood of Christ are truly contained in the sacrament. And here's how they went about explaining that. They went back to Aristotle, which that's a ways back, right? Plato and Aristotle. This is before the time of Christ. Aristotle defined the world around us in terms of substance and accidents. The substance was what the thing really is in its inner being, its reality. The accidents were how you perceive it. What it feels like, what it tastes like, what it smells like, what it sounds like, that kind of thing. And so the theology of the council declared that the substance of the bread and the wine were gone once they were blessed and consecrated by the priest. It was no longer bread, it was no longer wine. It was indeed the body and blood of Christ, but the accidents remained. That's why it still tastes like bread, that's why it still tastes like wine, why it still looks the same. So they went all the way back to Aristotle. Of course, in the Middle Ages, that's not a bad thing. When you ground your decisions in Plato and Aristotle and the great thinkers of the past, they have a lot of respect for that. So that part is not a surprise that they would have utilized Aristotle for that. We also have at this time, not a part of the council, but a concurrent development, what's known as the elevation of the host. If you have ever been to Catholic Mass, at some point you see the priest holding the host up, some of them way up, some of them on a more right in front of them. Beginning in about the 12th century, this starts happening. When the priest says the line, "This is my body," in Latin, of course, they elevated the host, and it became the sort of the high point, the culmination of the Western Latin Mass is that moment when he does that. And one other development that you'll recognize the name of it when I get to it. In 1264, Pope Urban IV, inspired by an Augustinian nun named Juliana, establishes a feast day entirely focused on the body and blood of Christ, called Corpus Christi. All right, body of Christ. This could be a whole separate topic, and it's a fascinating one. By the late Middle Ages, the feast calendar for the church is chock full of days. Feast days for saints, feast days for all sorts of things. It's a fascinating development. By the 14th century, so not long after, this is one of the most important feasts of the entire church calendar. There are guilds that promote and maintain their churches, their parishes' participation in it. They have what is in essence a block party. celebrating this day every year. It becomes an important part of village life, especially live in a small village, right? You don't go far from it. You don't read or write, but this day is a big party every year. It becomes an important thing. And so we're moving in that direction. All right, one little bit at a time, in one way or another, in the way the Mass is conducted, in the feasts of the church, in the theology of the council, towards the greater sacramentalism of the Eucharist, to use a word that hopefully works. So that's the direction the church is heading in. In the meantime, we have John Wycliffe. And I spelled it on here, Wycliffe. You can find it at least 5 different ways. With Wyclif, 2 F's, EF on the end, LIFE on the end, or LIFFE on the end. I have no idea, but for some reason nobody could spell his name in the history, in the records. So that's a funky one. 1330 to 1384. He was a philosopher at Oxford. You've heard of that. Beginning in the 1370s, he turns his criticisms against many of the foundational contemporary church institutions and practices. One of his theological points, and this is going to take us all the way back to St. Augustine, was that the true church is made up only of those who are saved, and so the visible church is not the same as the true church. Now, Augustine understood this, right? But remember that he was living in a time when the church was a small minority, or at least a minority in a hostile empire. Wycliffe is thinking about this 1,000 years of Christendom later, where everybody is baptized, everybody is expected to be a part of the church, everybody is assumed to be a part of the church. And so Wycliffe looks at that and says, that can't be. All these people can't possibly be real members of the church. In addition to that, he emphasized the authority of the Bible in the place of the church, and he did something that at the time was wild. He urged the laity to read the Bible. Here's a quote. I got this out of the Cambridge History of the Bible. They didn't list, and I couldn't find who they were quoting, but it's a contemporary of Wycliffe. He said this: Wycliffe translated the gospel of the church so that by his means it has become vulgar and more open to laymen and women who can read than it is usually to quite learned clergy of good intelligence. And here's his conclusion to that. And so the pearl of the gospel is scattered abroad and trodden underfoot by swine. This was a guy that didn't appreciate that your blacksmith and your baker and your fishermen and women were reading the Bible. In addition, Wycliffe rejected transubstantiation. This is an argument that will be picked up again, of course, by Luther and following. The University of Oxford was divided. People following Wycliffe, people against him. He and his followers were nicknamed Lollards, which doesn't sound like anything in English. It's an insult for using a Dutch word. A Lollard is the Englishized version of the Dutch word meaning mumblers. In other words, they called them, fools that just mumble nonsense. And that's where that comes from. So if you ever read about the Lollards, those are followers of Wycliffe, people that he inspired that were critical of the church and wanted to reform it. Wycliffe himself is involved, it wasn't him personally, but I'm not just him, with translating the Bible into English for the first time. The first complete English Bible translation from the Latin Vulgate. However, and this overlaps with our History of the Bible seminar if you want the fuller part of this story, this is the Reader's Digest version. In 1407, all existing versions of the Bible in English were officially banned by the church in England, the English church hierarchy, because they didn't want the laity reading it. Again, from a modern perspective, with an educated populace, living in a democracy where we consider everyone being educated to be a good thing, that doesn't make any sense. But we're 500 years after the, well, in this case, close, more than 700 years after the fact. I'm sorry, just under 700 years, and they had a very different view of that. However, that's not stopping anything. Between 1466 and 1522, we have a ton of editions of the Bible that are translated and printed in German, Italian, French, Dutch, Spanish, Czech, Catalan, etc., etc. And this line cannot be overstated. Bibles in the vernacular, cheap because of the printing press, were a necessary precursor to the Reformation. The Reformation happens in the 16th century because of the printing press. It could not have happened sooner without the printing press. Could not is a strong word, but it did not and was unlikely to. Because not only did the printing press put the Bible in the hands of the people in their own languages, which they hadn't had before, and so many people are reading the text that had not had access to it before, but also posters and pamphlets and essays can be printed cheaply and spread all over the place. The writings of Luther, soon after he writes them, are all over the place. And that, of course, would have been unheard of in previous generations when everything had to be copied by hand. So the pace of reform or revolution, depending on your perspective, is greatly increased, not just in religion, but also in politics and everything else, by the printing press. Our next person of note is Jan Hus. If you'd call him Hus if you're an American, probably, but it's something closer to Hus in Czech. 1369 to 1450, so a little bit later. He's a dean of philosophy, another university man in Prague, that is inspired by Wycliffe. He reads some of his stuff and becomes inspired by him. And he starts boldly attacking the parts of the church that he believes needs to be reformed. But in this case, it becomes connected with the assertion of Czech identity, so a new thought that is coming along in the same time frame that's going to become a big deal later on is nationalism. Right? The idea of being French or English or German or something and having your nation. Well, this is the beginnings of that for the Czech people. Right? CZECH, the Czech people. Hus is excommunicated in 1412. Something that really bothered him and that he started doing after that was offering the elements, the bread and the wine, to the laity, both of them. And this was the first time in centuries that the people, the common people, had been offered both, at least here. Wycliffe didn't believe in transubstantiation. He didn't really have a love and an attachment to the Eucharist. Hus was the opposite. He had the same ideas of reform as Hus, but he wanted to reform the thing that he loved rather than change the thing that bothered him, if you can see the difference in that. At the Council of Constance in 1415, Jan Hus was promised safe conduct by the Holy Roman Emperor. Come to this council, explain yourself, and we'll talk about it. The Holy Roman Emperor's name was Sigismund. However, a representative of the papacy convinced the Holy Roman Emperor that if you make a promise to a heretic, you don't have to keep it. Those promises don't count. And so Hus was convicted of heresy and burned at the stake. But he became a powerful symbol to his people as a martyr, and also convinced a lot of people that the institutional church could not deal with reform, that it was incapable of taking that impulse and embracing it and understanding it. So following Jan Hus, a man named Jan Zelivsky, who was a preacher, like Jan, led an insurrection, an actual violent revolt against the authority. And what we have here is called the first defenestration of Prague. Defenestration simply is the Latin for throw someone from a window. And that's actually what they did. In an upper window, 13 Catholic loyalists were thrown out of the window. Not that's an interesting form of protest, not good for those 13 people. This was the first time in the West that we see large-scale destruction of monasteries and Christian art. Remember, we had the iconoclast controversy in the East way back in the 8th century and into the 9th century. In the West, there was no such thing until now. People are looting and burning monasteries. They're smashing statues and that sort of thing. Warfare will continue in Bohemia, which is where the Czech people lived. That was the province's name, for 2 centuries. And their movement will get folded into the Reformation as we get closer to it. So after that Civil War, an independent Hussite church, that's what they called it in honor of Jan Hus, a Hussite church survived. They worshiped in Czech rather than in Latin, which was, of course, a innovation for the time. And they insisted that the people received the elements in both kinds. Both kinds in Latin is Utraquist, and that was known as the Utraquist Church. They, in a sense, reconciled with Rome, said, let us do it our way, let us give them both elements, let's do it in Czech, but then we can solve this. The group of followers of Jan that did not reconcile with Rome were known as the Bohemian Brethren or the Moravian Brethren. They will have a huge influence on John Wesley. Wycliffe, Jan Hus, the Brethren, John Wesley. You can see how that flows all the way from England to Bohemia, back to England, over to America as time goes on. Our next person is Desiderius Erasmus, 1466 to 1536. He's a priest, an academic. He spends most of his time doing academic things and very as little as he can doing priestly things. He was more a scholar than a real than a priest. In 1516, he publishes a Greek New Testament, compiling the manuscripts that he had at his disposal. He only had about 12 of them, and he puts them together and publishes them as a Greek New Testament. He was motivated by the belief that bad grammar leads to bad theology. And that is a fascinating premise to anyone who's taken some theology classes or the like, because you start to realize that the value of grammar and the importance of words and their meaning and and phrases and the way they're organized for interpretation. And he wanted people to be reading the New Testament in Greek to cut down on that, rather than in Latin. He also was upset, not that he disliked the Latin Vulgate. He still thought it was useful. He also was upset that people were allegorizing everything. Every story in the Bible, every teaching, they're thinking this is a big allegory. This is what this means, and that's what that means. And it wasn't built on a foundation. It was just whatever you think it means. He didn't like that. His Greek New Testament inspired many people, like Martin Luther, who's coming next, to start studying the text of the Bible in the original languages, in the Hebrew and the Greek again. Despite being critical of the church himself, Desiderius Erasmus, he does not leave the church. Luther's like, come on, and he's like, nope, I'm here. He was a scholar, not an activist, not any of those things. But his work set up Martin Luther. All right, let's pause for a moment in the middle of this one because this is a long one. Any questions about any of those people or those developments before we dive into Martin Luther himself? Yep.
Was he killed?
He was not. It's surprising that he was not martyred. Maybe he didn't live long enough. But the things that he set in motion, I mean, if he'd have been doing those same things 100 years later, they would have burned him at the stake probably. So he was kind of in that sort of, and he had friends. He was at Oxford. He was respected in that, and it would have been a big step for the church hierarchy to try as a heretic and kill a member of the Oxford's faculty. So, all right. Martin Luther, and the yearn for reform. We are heading in that direction. Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546. He was an Augustinian monk. Rather than a priest, he was a monk, but many of the same duties. He arrived in 1511 at the University of Wittenberg as a teacher. What is important about that university is that it is in Saxony. And Friedrich of Saxony is one of the 7 people that elects the Holy Roman Emperor. Every time the emperor dies, these 7 people, these 7 electors, each have 1 vote. So you got to get 4 votes, right, to be elected the next Holy Roman Emperor. So he's a powerful dude. And Friedrich will become Luther's protector. When things go sour, he will keep Luther from being arrested, for being put on trial, and ending up like Jan Hus. In 1515, Martin Luther starts lecturing on the book of Romans. He's strongly influenced by St. Augustine. He does not appreciate the teaching of Thomas Aquinas on this, which of course Aquinas was all the rage in most of the universities at this time. The emphasis, or sort of the turning point of his lecture through Romans was Romans 1:17. I'm going to take a little detour for a minute and try to explain, this is a longer conversation, but try to explain where this ends up. So Romans 1:17 in the NIV says, "For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." And the King James is similar. In that verse is the quotation of Habakkuk 2:4, "He through faith is righteous shall live." So it's talking about the righteous man living by faith, right? Well, the common interpretation of most people in Martin Luther's day was based on the Latin Vulgate. And the Latin Vulgate, instead of the righteous, obviously righteousness is an English word, the word that had been used by Jerome to translate that there in Romans 1:17 was justitia, justice, from which we would get the word justification. So it's a legal term that people are reading when they get to Romans 1:17. And they concluded that that verse was about our need to measure up to God's justice, like the scales of justice. And so that verse in their minds was about how the sacraments of the church, how penance and ultimately purgatory could help us measure up to God's justice. But when Martin Luther reads it in Greek, he sees the word dikaios, which does not have in the Greek any element of judicial thinking in it. And that's just one. Translation work has quirks to it. The original Greek word didn't have that connotation to it. So he starts thinking about that, and he realizes that when we're talking about the righteousness of God in Romans 1:17, we're talking about God declaring sinners righteous. Not them earning righteousness, but God saying, you are righteous in Christ. And so that changed his thinking on that. He realized the verse was talking about the righteousness of God. When it was talking about that, it was talking about how God had acted in history to redeem humanity. One of the problems that existed in this interpretation of this time period is that there was a lack of clarity regarding the difference between justification and sanctification. Justification is that legal aspect, right? The payment for sins and the declaration of being not guilty because of the blood of the Lamb. Sanctification is the discipleship, the purification that comes after that. Sanctification, the sacraments are part of that, right? The work of the church, the rituals, the things that the laity, the people are doing to practice their faith is part of sanctification, but it's not a part of justification. It's a cart and horse thing, right? You got to make sure you know which one you're talking about. So Luther is thinking about that, and that is a light bulb that goes off in his head. Because as a monk, right? Someone who worked for the church, who dedicated his life to God, he still felt guilty about his sins. And he couldn't understand why that was. He still felt afraid that he didn't measure up. He saw the law of God and the gospel and the grace as basically the same thing. But when he realized that faith is the key to receiving God's righteousness, that it's not about us, here's his quote: "I was born again of the Holy Spirit, and the doors of paradise swung open, and I walked through." He realized that it wasn't so hard, that all he had to do was trust in Christ. And so for the rest of his days and his influence, he's going to talk an awful lot, Martin Luther, about the opposition of law to grace. It was not until 1530 that he rejects the idea of purgatory. All right? And here's a quote from McCulloch, from Diarmaid McCulloch. This is his book on the Reformation. I brought this one as well. It's an awesome one. It's another 700 pages from him, just on the Reformation. But his other book from previously, here's his quote: "Purgatory, that great theological success story with all its attendant structures of intercessory prayer for the dead, the chantries, the guilds, the hospitals, that comforting sense that through divine mercy we humans can busy ourselves doing something to alter and improve our prospects after death." It's hard for us to wrap our heads around how big this part of the life of the church was in Martin Luther's day. All the things that people were doing in order to lessen their own penalty, right? In order to ensure their salvation for the dead and all of that. Which leads us to the question of indulgences, which is a part of that system. These are grants in the Western Church, not something they have in the East, offering remittance of your penitence, of your payment in this life for the things that you've done. And the key issue is that you give money to get them. Beginning in, I don't have the date on there, Pope Leo X was trying to raise money to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica. Huge church building, was in woeful need of repair, cost an awful lot of money, and he didn't have it. So he's like, how can we raise money, right? Starting with a good idea, right? This is a beautiful church, we need to fix it. Well, let's sell indulgences. And preachers went out to raise the funds. Well, the most notorious was a Dominican named Johann Tetzel, and this was his line, this was his sales pitch. "Won't you part with even a farthing, like a penny, to buy this letter? It won't bring you money, but rather a divine and immortal soul, whole and secure in the kingdom of heaven." So in that sense, he is no different than the guy on cable TV late night, right, promising you things if you send money in to his ministry. There was a lot of people, not just Martin Luther, that were upset about the commercialization of all of this and how far, and one step at a time, one policy at a time, one development at a time, right? These things over time become what they were. A lot of people saw that this needed to be reformed. There were bishops, there were priests in Spain, in Italy, everywhere that were saying, we got to do something about this, we got to do something about that. But as we saw with Jan Hus, at this point in its history, the church is not capable of responding to this very positively. So pause for half a sec. What you got?
So the indulgences started because of them wanting to raise money to rebuild the church?
Yes. This big push for them. The concept was not just there. Remember that we had in the Crusades the concept that if you die fighting the infidel, you get out of purgatory, you can go straight to heaven. This is a continuation of that. Instead of service in battle, you're giving money, right? But it's that same theological thought. All right, so where's Martin Luther going with this? Famously, October 31st, 1517, that's 4 days, 505 years ago, right? We celebrated the 500th anniversary in 2017. Martin Luther famously posts his 95 theses, his 95 statements. You're like, dude, can we narrow that down a little bit? That's an awful lot of them. He nails them to the wall, to the door of the Wittenberg church, because that's the way you invite a debate if you're a university professor or student. If you want to debate someone, you put it on the door and wait for somebody to take up the challenge. In his thesis, he's rejecting the idea of indulgences. His premise is, if God gave us this by grace, why are we paying for it? Right? And so in this fight, Martin Luther will be talking about St. Augustine's theology of grace. He will be drawing upon St. Augustine. Cardinal Cajetan, the primary antagonist at this point of the story for Martin Luther, will be pushing back with St. Augustine's view of church authority and telling him it doesn't matter, you have to obey your superiors in the church hierarchy. Look what St. Augustine said about that. And so once again, we're fighting using St. Augustine, because he wrote so much and had so many different opinions, two different people, both quoting St. Augustine, against each other. In 1519, Martin Luther has a debate with a man named Johann Eck, and this is where he crosses the Rubicon. Right, to use an analogy. This is where he goes past the point of no return. In that debate, he says, I am sure on this that many of Huss's beliefs were completely evangelical and Christian. In other words, you guys burned at the stake a man that was right. And that's not going to sit well. In 1520, he is excommunicated. And Luther will publicly take the papal bull, that piece of paper that says, hey, to whom it may be concerned, you've been excommunicated, and he will burn it publicly with University of Wittenberg students cheering him on. And his response will be to publish a tract, a T-R-A-C-T-S, a tract, right? And because of the printing press, this is going to go everywhere. And he calls it the Babylonian captivity of the church. So he says the church is in captivity like Israel of old in Babylon, and the papacy is the captor, and they're not going to appreciate that. Those were obviously fighting words. Martin Luther ends up at this position. He will reject, because of his understanding of grace, right, Romans 1:17, the idea that Christ's sacrifice is in any way repeated or invoked or whatever at the Mass. But, and this is where he ends up sort of in the middle, he will, and Lutherans do, maintain that the real body and blood of the Christ is present there. All right, for clarity's sake, we call that consubstantiation versus the transubstantiation of the Catholic Church. You got to dig into it to get all of the particulars. I'm trying to make it as simple as possible there. So what happens next, right? How do we go from one man on a mission to an actual movement? Well, here's where it starts. Martin Luther and Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, at the Diet of Worms, and diet there meaning the council, right? This is the gathering of the government of the Holy Roman Empire, and Charles V is presiding over it. At this moment in history, he is the most powerful man in the entire world. And it's not even very close. Okay? He is the king, right? He's inherited these lands as a Habsburg. The Netherlands, Eastern France, Austria, Spain, and the entirety of Spain's overseas colonies in Central and South America, and all of their gold. That's the biggest thing that gave him power. At this hearing, Martin Luther is commanded to recant. They give him a chance. You can denounce the things that you said before. You can recant them and come back to the graces of the church. And here's how he responded. He declares, and we'll talk about this, "Here I stand, I can do no other." And you may have heard that. We don't know if he actually said that. His biographer wrote that he said that, but it's really pithy. It's an awesome thing to have said. So I don't know if Luther thought of it at the time, or if his biographer is sort of, taking the 2 paragraphs that he said and narrowing it down to an awesome poster. But it's a great line. It will become the motto of Protestants. And actually, this will become the basis of modern Western civilization and the rise of individualism. The idea that you as an individual can stand against an institution, against your government, against science, against anything, right? If you follow your convictions, be your own person. That starts with Martin Luther. All right? Other people before him are not doing this, because that is not the ancient way. The ancient way is to be with your tribe, to be with your people, to be under that authority of those above you. So Martin Luther is in many ways the first modern person. Obviously, parts of him are very much stuck in the medieval world, but this is something amazing. Here is a quote that we do believe is accurate because it was recorded in the recordings of the trial, or of the diet. He says this: "Unless I am convinced by the testimony of the Scriptures or by clear reason, for I do not trust either in the Pope or the councils alone, since it's well known they have erred often and contradicted themselves. I am bound by the Scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the Word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. May God help me, amen." See, that's probably what he said there, and then they boiled it down to "here I stand, I can do no other." But the sentiment of that is what Luther was saying, right? I can't go against what I think the Scriptures are teaching. I can't go against what my conscience is telling me. Now, you and I, as Americans, in the postmodern world, that makes an awful lot of sense. Don't go against your conscience. Don't go against what you believe. In 1521, this is radical. This is earth-shattering, right? This is as far out there as Thomas Jefferson saying, right, all men are created equal, and people going, whoa, 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 dude, what are you talking about? I know there's contradictions in that, but still, that was a big deal. And in this case, Charles kept his promise of safe conduct. He didn't have Luther thrown in prison. The politics are a little bit different. He is in this position. So what happens next? That reform becomes Reformation. We mentioned Friedrich of Saxony before. He's one of the electors, one of the 7 people that elected Charles, and he will protect Martin Luther. Just because Charles V is the most powerful man in the world does not mean that he can run roughshod over the parts of the Holy Roman Empire. All right? He's their liege lord. He doesn't own that land. It's a complicated thing. And so therefore, if Friedrich is willing to protect him, Charles can't do anything about it. During this time, Luther will translate the Bible into German, and that have a huge impact on Germany. And he will also write a little ditty, a little hymn you might have heard of called "A Mighty Fortress." In the 1520s, it spreads beyond just Martin Luther and his followers. In Zurich, Switzerland, a man named Zwingli, another local parish priest, will take things a step further. Their city council in Zurich will be set up to decide all things based on Scripture. And that is a fascinating way to run a city council meeting, right? What does the Scriptures say about jaywalking? What do the Scriptures say about zoning ordinances and all of that? I'm pretty sure most of you would rather do just about anything than go to a city council meeting. But if there was a theology debate every week, it might be interesting. So that is a change, and that is an interesting way of looking at things. This is the beginning here in Zurich of what will become known as the Reformed movement. We'll talk more about them later. They will differ from Martin Luther on 3 key things. Number one, they were very much against images, and they removed them systematically from all of the churches in their area. Martin Luther had no problems with statues in his churches. Secondly, they had a positive view of the law. Luther, right, he's saying the law is opposed to grace. They're saying the law is positive because they saw themselves as the new Israel. When they read Israel in the Bible, they said us, which of course is a different kind of theological error. And they completely rejected sacramentalism in the Eucharist and in baptism. Luther did not, right? He reformed the sacramentalism, but he didn't let it go. Not for baptism, not for the Eucharist either. Eventually, Martin Luther himself will say that the Zwinglians, the followers of Zwingli, the Reformed Christians, are farther from the truth than the Pope. So they take his reforms and go a step further, and he's like, dude, no, that's not what I want. But of course, they're not listening to him. They're their own, on their own path. In 1525, war will break out in and around the areas where Luther's influence is felt. It's called the Peasants' War. And Martin Luther was horrified by it. The peasants rose up against their aristocratic betters, right? Saying, we don't want to be serfs anymore, we want to be free men, right? Luther inspired us, and he's like, that's not what I meant either. So we've got two cases of people taking his ideas and going much further than he was willing. He actually came out and wrote things in support of the aristocracy in this. All right, a reformer he was, but he's not a pry this gun from my cold dead fingers kind of rebel. That is not Martin Luther. The revolt is crushed. The peasants are slaughtered as they always were during this. They're going up against knights on horseback, right, with their pitchforks and whatnot. It was brutal. Beginning in 1529, Luther's followers start being called protesters or Protestants. And then in 1530, we have the writing of by a friend, with the help of a friend of Martin Luther, a man named Philip Melanchthon, what's known as the Augsburg Confession, which basically codifies Luther's theology. So let's take a pause from that. We've got past Luther. We've got just a couple of quick things to go about the Reformation before we see the effects of it. Questions about Luther? Obviously, there are a huge number of books written about Martin Luther. You can get some awesome biographies if you're interested in the man. His life is fascinating. The end of his life is not good. He ended his life full of anti-Semitic rantings. Something happened there, which is sort of sad. It's very sad just to see the direction he ended. All right, two more. We're at the time of maps. I like the maps. The next thought is about the Anabaptists. They started, I got to talk about the map first, sorry. Here's the map of areas where there were Anabaptists. You see they're spread around. You've got them in Holland. You've got them in what is today modern-day Germany, down towards Switzerland, and pockets of them. So who are these guys and what are they about? Well, the first thing you need to know about the Anabaptists in the 16th century is that nobody else likes them. Not anybody. All right? They took Zwingli's logic, right? Zwingli, when he decided that sacramentalism and baptism don't go together anymore, he was saying that you need to pledge your faith in order for baptism to do you any good. It needs to be inside you. It needs to be real for you. Otherwise, it's just a ceremony. And they said, well, if it needs to be real, why are we doing it for infants? Which Luther didn't let go of, Zwingli didn't let go of, none of those people did. There's a good reason for it. I'll get to it. And so they said we should have believers' baptism. That's why they called them Anabaptists. It means the rebaptizers. Because, of course, every Anabaptist had been baptized as a child, right? Because it was universally practiced all over Christendom. So they all had been baptized once. This is a second one. Well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? Zwingli took Luther and went further than he was comfortable with. Well, the Anabaptists take Zwingli and go further than what he's comfortable with. He is appalled. It's a theme, right? Because he believed that the church is the entire city of Zurich. Every man, woman, and child in this town is part of the church. And the thought, the idea that you could opt out, that you could say, actually, I don't want to be a part of the church. No, right? They had, no. They couldn't stomach that at all because the people would be divided. We wouldn't all be together. We'd have people that are in the church, people that are out of the church, and they just could not understand that. Remember, this is 1,000 years of Christendom, 1,000 years of everybody being baptized, of them not, in every village around, everyone is part of a parish church. There's no exceptions. So in Zurich, they started persecuting the Anabaptists, and at least 4 of them were murdered. The way they murdered them was their version of irony. They drowned them. They said, if you want to go under the water, we'll just hold you down there and see how God responds. But they raise a key question. Who is in the church? That's what Wycliffe had raised a couple hundred years ago, right? The Catholics, the Lutherans, and the Reformed had this thought in common. All of society is part of the church. None of them believed that it was your choice, right? Everybody is baptized into the church. Everybody is a part of the church. It's that idea of Christendom what was ingrained. Luther wasn't trying to change that. Zwingli wasn't trying to change that. When the Anabaptists tried to change that thought, they just made everybody mad. It's not the best idea, right? It's like in politics when you have both the liberals and the conservatives yelling at you at the same time. You're like, how did I manage that, right? Well, what could I possibly say that would make them both mad? Well, the Anabaptists figured out how to get all 3 groups mad at them when all 3 groups couldn't agree on much of anything, right? So that's, yay for you. So what is the result of the Reformation? Europe ends up being divided, and we'll get to the map again next, roughly along a north-south line, along pre-existing geographical and cultural boundaries. Remember when we talked about the East and West split, the Greek East, the Latin West, how the geography and the economy and the culture was already on that line? That's exactly what happens, for the most part, with the Reformation. A southern-northern split. So you end up with Germany and Scandinavia becoming Lutheran, with Switzerland and Holland becoming Reformed, and with Poland and France as an asterisk, we'll get back to that, and the Habsburg lands, the Habsburg monarchy, that'd be Spain and Austria, remaining Catholic. Of course, officially in this era, France is a Catholic nation, but they have a massive Protestant minority, and they will soon be at war with each other, with the Huguenots and against the monarchy and all of that. And then you have England, which early on stayed with the Catholic Church, but later on switches sides, sort of, because they go about halfway and stop there. And that's in 1534 under Henry VIII, and you know the reasons for that. Henry's many divorces. One more quick thought before we look at the map is the Battle of Mohawks in 1526. So we've got all of this theological fighting happening, right? People arguing about the Eucharist and what it means and how to understand it, arguing about who is in the church and who's not in the church, and all of that. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire is advancing up the Balkans towards the heart of Christian Europe, and in 1526 they destroyed an army led by King Louis of Hungary. He's the Holy Roman Emperor's brother-in-law. In this battle, 5 bishops and 2 archbishops are killed. This is a massive blow to the old guard, to the people that stood for keeping things the way they are. Because if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? We're the guardians of stability and all of that. Well, they just got crushed in battle. And it reminds us that there's an existential threat to Christian Europe happening on the border right over there. Let's take a look at the map. This is our map in 1555. So you have the southern tier, right, of Catholicism. You've got Lutheranism in the northeast. You've got sort of you've got Anglicanism coming there in the middle, and then you've got this Reformed slice sort of here, from Switzerland to Netherlands to Scotland. And then, of course, over here you get a little bit of them in Transylvania as well. But here is that line of the Ottoman Empire. They've got Budapest. They're going to be laying siege to Vienna a couple of times. And so that's going on in the background. Spain has been reconquered, but the battle is currently right here in the Balkans in Eastern Europe. And then, of course, over in the blue, you've got the Orthodox Church, which is not really part of this conversation. This is a Western thing. Looking at the map, thinking about what we said about the Reformation, we have questions. We're going to take another pause. I am so not on time. All right. I got to pick up the pace. The 30 Years' War is what happens next. And this map has a lot to do with explaining why. Have you ever seen a busier map than that? Holy cow, look at all the colors, look at all the little tiny pieces. It took me a long time to find a good map of the Holy Roman Empire. This one's in German. But it wouldn't help me if it wasn't, because all the writing is so darn tiny because there's so many pieces, right? That's what the Holy Roman Empire was. Hundreds of little spots. You got some big pieces, right, like Bohemia over there on the east, but tiny little ones, all these mixed loyalties. The question from 1618 to 1648 during the 30 Years' War is Protestantism going to survive? Or will it be destroyed at the point of a sword? In 1545, you have the Council of Trent and the beginning of the Counter-Reformation. So the Reformation actually spurred the Catholic Church to do some of the reforms that they refused to do before. And there are some significant changes. Some of it is a reaction against Protestantism, but a lot of other reformation, or a lot of reform did happen. In 1546, Martin Luther dies. So who is at the forefront? The next person to step forward and be an influential person in these events is John Calvin. He's an exiled Frenchman, don't hold it against him, established in Geneva. And he creates a system of church government by committee. If you love church committees, thank John Calvin. He's the one that invented this. They called them presbyteries. In 1536, he publishes his Institutes of Christian Religion, a giant compilation of his theology. His big focuses are human depravity, Augustine would appreciate that, and predestination. Calvin tried to reconcile Lutheranism and the Reformed movement that he was a part of so that they could be united against Catholicism, and it didn't work. Their differences were too wide. They couldn't come to an agreement. In 1563, they published the Heidelberg Catechism, and that is their way of saying, these are all the things that Protestants can agree on. Can we all just sign on to this, right? Can we get together? The response on the battlefield is what comes in 1547, the Schmalkaldic League. They could have picked a harder name. Look at that one. They were defeated by the Holy Roman Emperor in 1547. And so it seems, that's a collection of German Protestants, it seems like the Catholic cause is on its way up, on the battlefield largely, right? The growth of Protestantism in the Holy Roman Empire convinced Charles that he couldn't stamp it out completely. He's the Holy Roman Emperor. He's the most powerful man in the world. But remember that crazy map. He can't stamp it out everywhere because that's not the way his authority works. He would have to lay siege to city after city, destroying people all over the place. And so in 1555, they put forth an interesting document called the Peace of Augsburg. And the territories in the Holy Roman Empire would follow the faith of their ruler. Cuius regio, vius religio in Latin, whose realm, whose religion. In other words, if your duke is a Protestant, then you are. If he's Reformed, then you are. If he's Lutheran, then you are. If he's Catholic, then you are. It wasn't about the people. It's sort of a top-down way of looking at it. If you differed from your ruler, then they said just, move. And in the Holy Roman Empire, it might only be about 10 miles before you get to a new territory that has a different ruler. They did not, that was just for the Reformed, or for the Lutherans and the Catholics. They didn't include the Reformed, all right? They wouldn't consider them to be worthy of being part of this treaty. And nobody bothered with the Anabaptists because they weren't getting any shake no matter what. But war is brewing. In France, the Reformed Protestants, the Huguenots, begin to challenge the French monarchy, and some of this has to do with the politics of France, right? It's not a united nation like it will later be under Louis XIV or whatever. For 50 years, they will fight for control of France, most famously the 1572 St. Bartholomew Day massacre. In Scotland, the Reform activists will overthrow Mary, Queen of Scots, and set up the Scottish Presbyterian Church. In the Netherlands, the Catholic Spanish Habsburg rulers, right, Charles V's family, will be thrown out and the Reformed Church established, leading to war that lasts a long time with them, the Spaniards trying to retake the Netherlands. And of course, in England, you've got Elizabeth's movement towards Reformation going about halfway. One quick note, in 1568, the Transylvanian Diet. All right, in Transylvania, you've got the Ottomans on this side, the Habsburgs on that side. They are in a bad spot geopolitically. But they put forth this statement, and I think it's noteworthy, because this is 1568. Ministers should everywhere preach and proclaim the gospel according to their understanding of it. And if their community is willing to accept this, good. If not, however, no one should be compelled by force if their spirit is not at peace. No one is permitted to threaten, to imprison, or banish anyone because of their teaching, because faith is a gift from God. That's something Roger Williams would have signed off on, right? So they're way ahead of the game. Of course, they've got these powerful empires on both sides of them at each other's throat. So they weren't in any position to go further with that. But it's fascinating that way back then they were thinking that. Developments in the wider world that will affect the 30 Years' War. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where Don Juan of Austria, happens to be Charles V's bastard son, leads a fleet that crushes the Turks in the Adriatic. And that will, for a generation, stop that existential threat of the Ottomans coming up the Balkans. They were a threat to Italy, they were a threat to the entire Mediterranean, but that fleet got just annihilated in that battle. And then, of course, in 1588, you have the famous Spanish Armada, where the Habsburgs, send a massive fleet to try to retake England and force them back into the Catholic fold, but storms and plucky British admirals and whatnot, they'll take all the credit, managed to foil it. And then in 1618, you have, because the first one was such a hit, the second defenestration of Prague. They threw people out the window again, but this time they put like a cart full of straw at the bottom. So it was more symbolic than actually throwing people out of the second floor window normally is. And so now the war is picking up again in the Bohemian lands. The Bohemian nobility elect Friedrich V, one of those 7 electors, to be their next king. So now he has 2 votes. But he's at war with the Holy Roman Emperor. So he has 2 votes for the next emperor, but he's at war with the current emperor. At the Battle of White Mountain in 1620, he is significantly defeated and goes into exile. He loses not only the crown of Bohemia, but his lands, his ancestral lands in Palatine, which in modern-day Germany as well. Ferdinand begins, he's the new Holy Roman Emperor, 1619, to revoke those rights of the Hussite Church. In 1619, 90% of Bohemia had followed Jan Hus and was a part of that Hussite Church. But that's going to get totally flipped around in a couple of generations because of that pressure. The war spreads. In 1622, the Catholic League sacks the city of Heidelberg. I've been there. I've been to the castle. I've seen Friedrich's castle. Friedrich was defeated at the Battle of White Mountain. He is in exile. He's not in his homeland. All right? And his city is taken, his castle captured. His world-renowned library, he had one of the world's best libraries, was carted en masse to the Vatican. It's still in the Vatican Library to this day, his collection. In 1629, you have the Edict of Restitution, and this tried to turn the clock back. The Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand says, I'm on a roll. I'm going to turn the clock back all the way back and give lands back to the church the way they used to be. I've already destroyed the Hussite church. That is the only church in Western history to come into being and then go back out in that sense. It was there for 200 years. But it was a disaster because not only did this provoke more of the Lutherans, it provoked some of his allies, the people that are supposed to be on his side. All right, and yes, he did have Lutheran allies. Some of the princes of the Holy Roman Empire said, we owe this guy our allegiance, even if it's against fellow Lutherans, we have to go to be loyal to him. But they said, wait a minute, you're going too far, you're power hungry. And most disastrously, this will provoke not only Catholic France to declare war on the Habsburgs, because they are terrified that the Habsburgs are going to become like Napoleon and take over the whole continent, but also the Swedes are going to join the war. So they were ascending and the Catholics were winning, and Ferdinand tried to put down his stakes and say, here, we've won. And that just made everybody upset and to gang up against him. Swedish King Gustav Adolphus in 1630 brings his army into Europe, into continental Europe, to fight against the Habsburgs. He was a brilliant general. And his arrival basically means that the 30 Years' War is a war for the entire continent. Just about everybody is involved now. And Protestantism is not going to be stamped out on the battlefield because of his brilliance and some of these other, having the French come in against the Habsburgs and the English, right? Everybody's ganging up against them. Lastly, you have the siege of Magdeburg in 1631. Magdeburg is an imperial free city. There's about 50 of these in the Holy Roman Empire. They have the right to govern things independently. They don't belong to anyone else's territory. There were 20,000 people in this city. It was put under siege and almost the entire population was slaughtered when the city fell. All right, this was to them as big an event as 9/11 or any one of these, massive tragedies that we think of in modern history, to have this city destroyed like that. People were like, has it really come to this? Is this what we're really doing now? No free city had ever been destroyed in the Holy Roman Empire before this. Eventually, we end up with the Peace of Westphalia. Notice the role of France in this war. France is an interesting character during this time period because for parts of 1536 to 1798, so before this and after this, the French will ally themselves with the Ottoman Turks against the Habsburgs, right? The guys that control Spain and Austria and parts of the Netherlands and parts of Germany. They're just like, you guys are too powerful, we need an ally, and they'll ally themselves with the Ottomans, which, again, you're allying yourself with Muslims against fellow Christians, who in their case happen to also be fellow Catholics because of power politics. The person that you know that is associated with that policy is a cardinal by the name of Richelieu. You know Cardinal Richelieu because Alexander Dumas has a caricature of him in Three Musketeers. Right? He's the bad guy in that. Whether that has history on its side or not is not part of the story. Even Pope Urban VIII regarded the Habsburgs as dangerous. Of course, remember, he still has the Papal States to worry about, and he gave thanks for Protestant victories over them. So on the one hand, you have theology. On the other hand, you have power politics. And strange bedfellows, all right, happen. And the Peace of Westphalia took 5 years to put together because the negotiations were completely complicated. What the English wanted out of it was different than what the Swedes, was different than what the Lutherans in Germany, right? Even though they're on the same side, they don't have the same goals. It took them forever to get it figured out. And where did we end up after all of this bloodshed? They ended up freezing the map as it was in 1624. They looked back and said, when was a time when Catholic and Protestant, Habsburg and non-Habsburg were sort of even Steven? And they found that in 1624. They gave religious minorities the right to worship if they had it in 1624. This time, the Reformed are included in it. So now you're free to be Catholic, Lutheran, or Reformed. Still no Anabaptist. Sorry about your luck, guys. Before this war, the Holy Roman Empire had existed since Charlemagne, right? And it was like, this thing's not going anywhere. But this war showed how fragile it was, right? It was basically a civil war within the Holy Roman Empire and for 30 years. In 1806, Napoleon will just sign a piece of paper and say the Holy Roman Empire doesn't exist anymore. So let's take a look at the map. We started with a complicated map. This is a similar map. This shows where which religious group dominates the area. You've got the Catholics in blue, you got the Lutherans in orange, the Calvinists in the yellow in the middle, the pink is the Lutherans when they have a Catholic minority. It's a little less messy, but it's not exactly neat either, right? So after the 30 Years' War, Central Europe, right, Eastern France, Germany, Austria, there's still plenty of places there in the Low Countries where the neighborhoods, right, where one area is Protestant, the next one is Catholic, the Lutheran, Reformed, like every which where. What about that war? Most people don't know anything about the 30 Years' War other than it lasted 30 years, right? That's your guess, like the War of 1812. That's what you know about it. At one point or another during the war, everybody in Europe was involved in this war except for Russia. Again, the Orthodox Russians had no stake in it. They stayed out. Religion was the catalyst. Religion made it more brutal, but it wasn't the only motivator. And at times it wasn't the primary motivator. Look at the example, of course, of France. A cynical view would be to see the war as a continuation of the dynastic rivalries between the Habsburgs and the Wittelsbachs. That's Frederick V's family. Within the Holy Roman Empire, and other people just jumping in when it suited them. But this war really showed people that you can't win your religious wars in battle. It doesn't work, right? 30 years, all these people dead, and we didn't change anything in any real way on that level. There's about 1 million pages of records about this war, but they're in 14 different languages all over libraries and museums and whatnot in Europe. So studying it is interesting. But notice the cost of this. We're nearing the modern era. The intensity and scope of the fighting varied from place to place. This wasn't like World War I, where it was continuous fighting month after month, right? There'd be brutal fighting, and then it would stop. And then it'd be in another place, and then it would stop. The total average population loss was 20%. Let me give you perspective. The Russians in World War II, right? They were brutalized in World War II. They lost 12%. The average loss in Europe in World War I was 5%. In World War II, it was 6%. The 30 Years' War is approximately 20%. Some areas never really saw any fighting, and their population actually grew during the war, partly because refugees are pouring there from other places. Other places saw 50 to 75% of the population gone by the end of the war, either dead or fled. 500,000 soldiers dead in battle, and disease killing a lot more than that. There were outbreaks of plague in 1622, 23, 25, 34, 46, and 50. So not only do you have war, you've got plague, you've got starvation, right? It was horrific. Stop and digest that, unfortunately, for a few minutes. I made this sort of a focus of this because most people don't know anything about the 30 Years' War. Until World War I, this was the war by which all wars were measured in European consciousness. Nothing will approach it until World War I. And even, again, World War I, the horror being that it was so concentrated in that one area along the Western Front. All right. A more positive conversation for the most part. The modern missions movement. How did Christianity spread from Europe to much of the rest of the world? That's the part of the story we are on now. This map shows us the empire of the Spaniards and the Portuguese, which of course, all over the place, and that will have something to do with it. We'll talk about that as well. So prior to Columbus, Christendom had no natural route left for expansion. The Scandinavian people to the north had been converted, right? The Slavic people to the east had been converted during the Middle Ages. And you had Islam to the south in Africa, to the east in Asia Minor. And you can't exactly send missionaries in that direction, right? That's not hospitable. So where do they go? They got nowhere to go, right? Then Columbus discovers, oh, there's another half of the world we didn't really know was there. The Catholic Christianity of Spain and Portugal spread rapidly to their colonies in the New World. Pope Julius II granted the Spanish monarchy something called a patronado, which is basically you have the right to preach the gospel in your territories. The Vatican later regretted the fact that they gave the Portuguese and the Spanish that much control, but they did. So what was it like in the New World for the spread of the gospel? The military conquests of Cortez against the Aztecs, of Pizarro against the Incas, were thought of by many of the people at the time as an extension of the Reconquista. Remember that the Spaniards and the Portuguese had been involved for centuries in driving the Muslims out of the Iberian Peninsula, right? And so that sort of holy war attitude, they just adopted it and said, well, let's do that over here too. And so on one level, the Pizarro and Cortez are saying, we're doing this in the name of Christ, we're conquering these lands that way. There's also gold that they were after, right? So don't think of it too idealistic or too religiously. But they thought of it in those terms. In 1500, a Franciscan and Dominican monks begin arriving and seeing the way the Spaniards and the Portuguese were treating the natives. And they're like, this is not acceptable. Bartolomé de las Casas was a plantation owner who had a conversion experience after listening to a Dominican preach, much like John Newton will have a conversion experience with his own attitude about slavery. And he will begin preaching that Jesus had no intention of converting people to his joyful tidings of the good news at the point of arms and bombardments, right? Jesus did not want the good news taken at the point of a sword, basically is what Bartolomé is saying. But despite those objections, Christian missions in South and Central America were backed up by military force. And this is a change, right? For the most part, during the history of Christianity in Europe, it was missionary activity and not conquest that spread the gospel. But in the New World, in Central and South America in particular, that is not the case. By 1550, there are 10 million baptized people in the Americas. Again, not all of them willing, right? That's part of the question. But of course, as we know at the same time, at least half of the people in the estimates are quite wide, had died because of disease, smallpox and the rest. In the Spanish New World, indigenous peoples could become assistants at the liturgy, but they were not allowed to become priests. There was some of that latent racism there. Not until the 18th century were they allowed to become priests. But they had an issue when that was lifted, because in these cultures, in Central and South America, they had no idea what to do with priestly celibacy, because that was not something that fit their culture at all. They're like, what? Right? They had an issue with that. And of course, Tridentine Catholicism, that's the word for the Counter-Reformation Catholicism, insisted upon doing the Mass in Latin, which is a barrier to people in these lands that you've declared to be a part of your empire, because they don't speak Latin. Priests in those territories were required to learn or to receive confession in the native tongue. So the priest at least had to know the language of the people to hear confession. But the Mass is in Latin. So that's going to make it difficult, just as it did in Europe before. Well, what about the East? This is a very different story. In Africa and Asia, when the Christian missionaries arrive, they arrive without troops at their back. Only in the Philippines do we have a Spanish colony that en masse converts a people. So this is a much more piecemeal, person by person, village by village kind of conversation. In Africa, one of the primary issues was that the missionaries were associated with the Portuguese slave trade. The reason they knew about Europeans was because the slave takers, right? In 1571, a Franciscan, another Bartolome, this guy Bartolome de Albornoz, said, "I do not believe that it can be demonstrated that according to the law of Christ, the liberty of the soul can be purchased by the servitude of the body." Something the later abolitionists would amen. In 1542, Francis Xavier founds the Jesuit College for Missionary Training in Portugal and leaves for Asia. But contrary to the New World attitude, Francis Xavier believed that the religions of the East, whether that's Hinduism or Buddhism or Taoism or Shinto, that these religions could reflect the purposes of God. Not that they had truth, but they could be a reflection of God's truth, sort of in general revelation. And so they respected the cultures of the people that they went to in a way that they didn't in Central and South America. In China, the Jesuits dressed as Confucian scholars in order to be accepted. Of the 376 Jesuits who set out for China from 1581 to 1712, 127 died before they even got there on the boat, because disease was working against them. In the New World, right, disease is working against the natives. But when Christian missionaries go to Africa or Asia, they're the ones dying at horrific rates from disease. At the height of their success in China, the Jesuits had 75 priests and 250,000 converts. I did the math. That comes out to 3,333 people per priest. That's a lot of work, right? That's a big parish. The Chinese emperor, however, expelled them from the country in 1724, so they started off well. What were the barriers and what were the setbacks in the East? Well, in Asia, the Jesuits faced peoples with a religion and a culture and a self-confidence that basically said, these Westerners can't teach us anything. All right? They didn't think there was anything to be learned. In India, and we talk about this in the World Religions Seminar, if you convert to Christianity from Hinduism, you lose your caste. And so the only people really willing to listen to the Dominican and Franciscan missionaries are the people in the bottom caste, because they got nowhere to go. They're already on the bottom. However, the Dominicans and I was talking about the Jesuits before. The Dominicans and the Franciscans arrive in the 1630s, and they go at the Jesuits because the Jesuits had been respecting the culture of the people that they were witnessing to. And the Dominicans and Franciscans said that is not acceptable. All right, you cannot make accommodations for their culture. In 1704, the Pope took their side in the argument, and the method of the Jesuits was abandoned, even though it had been, in many ways, highly successful. Which brings this question to the forefront of the missionary conversation. The Catholics are talking about it now. The Protestants will be talking about this same question when they join in to this in short order. Is sharing the gospel an exercise in syncretism, in merging local indigenous religion, culture, language into Christianity, like the Jesuits thought, or is it an attempt to replace indigenous religion, language, and culture with Western European language, culture? That's what the Dominicans and the Franciscans insisted. In other words, what can be retained from the original, from the people's culture? What can be adapted? What can be utilized? And what do you have to reject because it's a part of paganism or it's a part of idolatry or whatever? That is an important question in missions. But this is not the first time the church has dealt with this question. If you stop and think about it, if you realize it, Orthodoxy is Christianity with Greek culture married to it, and Western Catholicism, which, Western Christianity is Christianity with a Roman or Latin flavor. So we've done this before. Ironically, when the Jesuits went to Ethiopia and found Miaphystites, those people from way back that rejected the Council of Chalcedon, they had no business working with them. They're like, forget it, we can't make any accommodations for you. And when they dealt with Protestants, they didn't want to give them any slack. But they did when they worked with Hindus and Confucians and Shinto, followers of Shinto. They were like, no, we can work with that stuff. Fascinating blind spot in that way of thinking. Two examples of syncretism gone to an extreme are voodoo in French Haiti, which takes elements of the indigenous religion and Christianity, and Santeria in Spanish Cuba. But in 1773, the Catholic monarchs forced the Pope to suppress the Jesuits in the Society of Jesus, and their missionary work that had lasted 3 centuries came to an abrupt end. We're going to be switching to the Protestant mission movement in a minute, but we're going to take a moment to talk about Japan because this is a useful case. Japan was the most spectacular success in Asia or Africa, but ended in almost total destruction of the Christian community there. When Francis Xavier arrived in 1549 with his fellow priests, they were able to amass 300,000 converts by the end of the century. 300,000 in 50 years. That is massive success. When the Franciscans arrived in 1593, they were aggressively negative about Japanese culture, which you can imagine how that went over, right? Like a lead balloon. In 1600, the Tokugawa dynasty had united Japan. They got rid of all their feudal rivals, and they embarked upon a process of sort of Japanese-ifying, I can't think of the right way to, the island's culture. Purging it of Buddhism, purging it of Chinese influences, and alongside it, of Christian influences. They began persecuting those 300,000 Christians, many of them crucified, with all of the Europeans expelled. In the 1850s, when the Protestants come back, they will find a tiny, half-instructed fragment of a church left, almost completely destroyed by that persecution. And so the Japanese persecution is a standing argument, this is McCullough's conclusion, against the old idea that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. You've heard that phrase, right? The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Persecution leads to growth of the church. Not if it's handled like the Japanese did. And that, of course, reminds us and instructs us about what's happening in North Korea, what's happening in China today, what happens in Iran, and other places where that persecution is aiming to grind people down and wipe out the church, right? At a certain point, they're all dead or imprisoned, right? So the spread is not an easy thing to imagine. All right, what about the Protestants? The Protestants get in on it. Protestants were not involved in the early part of world missions because they were trying to survive, right, on the battlefield and in their countries, and they were trying to figure out what's the difference between Lutheran and Calvinist and Anglican and the other. How do we all come together? So it took them a little while. One of the first people of note in Protestant missions is Roger Williams. Famously, Roger Williams has a big role in Baptist history. He was one of the few colonists in what would soon be America to spread Christianity to the Native American population. One of the reasons why is because Puritan covenant theology basically said if they're elect, they'll ask us. Right? They're Calvinists. If they are of the elect, they will come to us and ask about Jesus. We don't have to take it to them because they're elect. They can't not be saved. That is an interesting approach, and of course, they kind of set missionary effort on the back burner. In 1633, John Eliot will produce the first Bible printed in North America. It'll be in Algonquin, and he will have thousands of converts. But of course it will not last because the tribes that he witnessed to will be largely wiped out by the coming colonists in their wars over territory. Missions and the abolitionist movement become tied together. In 1701, you have the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, an Anglican institution. Charles and John Wesley will leave England for Georgia on behalf of that society to work with the colonists. But that experience doesn't go well for them. And they come back and become connected to those Moravians, those Hussite Moravians we were talking about. And with that influence, John Wesley will have his own salvation experience. In 1739, he will begin preaching, open-air preaching, alongside George Whitefield. In 1740, Whitefield comes to America and becomes part of the Great Awakening with Jonathan Edwards. And John and Charles Wesley found Methodism. So we're gaining some momentum here. In 1788, John Newton will join the abolitionists. And there will be a profound, near universal shift in Christianity about the attitude about slavery in this time period. First to that conclusion are the Pennsylvania Quakers. They're the first ones in any corporate Christian body to specifically outlaw slavery in 1758. Hey, we're in Pennsylvania, right? Woo woo. In 1833, William Wilberforce, and there's an amazing movie about his life, finishes his long and bitter struggle against the slave trade in the British Empire. He will bring together evangelicals and Unitarians who both were abolitionists, which is an odd coalition because they didn't agree about much of anything else. 3 days before he died, that final law was passed. In 1839, Pope Gregory XVI will condemn it as well. So we are heading in that direction of the abolitionist movement and the missions movement together, talking about the value of all people. So let's look at Protestant missions in Africa in the early 19th century. If you were to look at Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, you would say, what's going to happen in this half of the continent in the next 50 years? You would have said this will all become Muslim territory. But it didn't. Because when Protestant missionaries arrived, it was not uncommon for them to come into a village that had never seen a white man before and start talking about Jesus, and the people say, hey, we know that guy. they're like, how on earth did you know that guy? There had been the spread of Christianity by trade routes and the migrations of people in the heart of Africa long before the white missionaries showed up. And so basically, they would have whole villages, whole areas convert because they were primed for the idea. It wasn't a new idea to them, which is pretty fascinating. One of the things that they did in Africa that was very effective, these Protestant missionaries, was to emphasize having local converts working alongside the foreign missionaries. In other words, bring a local along with you. He knows the culture. He knows the language. He can speak to the people more effectively and convey the message to them in a way that you cannot. But one of the things that made inroads difficult in Africa is because Christianity is against polygamy. And sub-Saharan African culture at the time was very much in favor of polygamy in many different ways. Obviously, it's not a monolith. And when they read the Old Testament, they said, whoa, Abraham's got more than one wife, right? Isaac's got more than one wife. How come I can't have more than one wife? And of course, the Protestant missionaries were like, well, you see, there's a reason, and it's a complicated conversation to have. What about India and China? Two famous names. William Carey, 1761 to 1834. He was a Baptist minister, founder of the Baptist Missionary Society. This man was a whiz with languages. He translated the Bible into 6 different Indian languages. How many of you could handle that? Learn 6 different Indian languages and translate the Bible into them. That's more than one life's work. William Carey is famously remembered as saying this, and it's an awesome quote: expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. However, his efforts in India never led to a critical mass. Just like the Jesuits before him, centuries before, he ran into the caste system. And it is a massively difficult barrier to overcome. Christian schools were wildly successful. The people loved the fact that they set up schools, but that didn't lead to conversions. The next person is Hudson Taylor. In 1865, he founds what's known as China Inland Mission. They were based in China, which is rare for this time period, not based in England, based in China, and they didn't seek outside donations. His missionaries dressed like their Chinese counterparts, just like the Jesuits, by the way. That's that conversation about culture. And their children were educated in China. Again, a rarity. During this time period, the children of the missionaries were usually at boarding schools back in America or in in England. They weren't with their parents on the mission field. Hudson Taylor spent 51 years in China. He brought over 800 missionaries, founded 125 schools, had 18,000 converts, and set up 300 mission stations in all 18 provinces of China. Makes you feel like you didn't get much done today, doesn't it? You're just like, what did I get done today? Taylor is a man out of time. All right, he accepted missionaries from any Protestant denomination, which of course most of his contemporaries were like, no, we're Lutherans, you got to be Lutheran, or we're Presbyterian, you got to be Presbyterian. He was like, hey, if you're Protestant, come on. And he accepted single women that could be missionaries, which again, nobody else was doing that. They're all like, no, you got to be married. So he was, for want of a better term, progressive. He was ahead of his time on many of the things that missionaries would later around the world adopt. What about Japan? In 1853, Commodore Perry and that great white fleet come back to Japan, and the Japanese are like, whoa! And the country is reopened, and new missionaries come back. Well, they don't have success. Today, Japan is one of the least Christianized countries in the world, only like 2%. And it just, they never could reiterate that. However, in Korea, which of course is very much connected to Japan culturally and linguistically and ethnically, I know they have a big argument about that between the Japanese and the Koreans about how much. Anyway, there was a Catholic diplomat serving in China. He went to Korea and had 10,000 converts before 1801. He and a couple of priests. All right, but in 1801, they began to be persecuted. The church there survived without its foreign missionaries, only the locals. They didn't have another priest for 30 years. When Japan invaded the country in 1910, the Christian Koreans were at the forefront of fighting against the Japanese invasion. And so they became associated not with colonialism, right? Not with the Westerners, but with Korean patriotism, with the idea of fighting for our own people. And so the church's fortunes post-World War II in Korea are night and day. It has exploded in South Korea in a way that obviously is complete opposite of Japan. Largely, or at least significantly in part, thanks to their being viewed as part of our culture, not the imperialist, not the colonialist culture. So let's pause for a minute. The only thing we got left is the church in the world today, which is some statistics and a few modern things. And I'm totally behind, so I'm going to have to fly through it. All right. Let's dig in, home stretch. There is the world's religions on the map today. First thing to note is World War I was not a war about religion. Remember the 30 Years' War and how that was kind of sort of about religion? World War I is not at all. All right? Because you have Anglican England fighting against anti-clerical France, right? This is after the French Revolution. With Orthodox Russia against Lutheran Germany, Catholic Austria, and Muslim Ottoman Empire. Religion had nothing to do with what side you were on in World War I. All right? All of those countries used religion to get people to want to fight the Huns and stop the Russians or whatever, but it was just a cynical ploy. Nobody actually took that serious, or at least that wasn't part of it anymore. After 4 years of slaughter, there's an awful lot of negativism, obviously a loss of belief and confidence. One of the things to note is that Pope Benedict XV tried to negotiate peace, and nobody cared. The countries weren't listening to the papacy anymore because things had changed. All right, these are modern nation states. They're not going to be threatened by excommunication or anything like that anymore. That was a much shorter version than what I had on the slide. Other events of the 20th century that lead us to where we are today, of course, don't want to fail to mention the Armenian genocide during World War I. About 1 million or more Armenian Christians were slaughtered by the Turks. That is still a sticking point in politics in that region to this day. You also have the complete switch of Greece and Constantinople. All right, with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, you've got Muslims fleeing to Turkey. You've got Christians fleeing from Turkey to Greece because they don't want to be on the wrong side of the border when the dust settles. There were 300,000 Christians, Greek Orthodox Christians, in Constantinople in 1924. By 1955, there were less than 2,000. Again, and this was happening all over the world, right? Between Pakistan and India, with the Muslims going this way and the Hindus going that way because they didn't want to be on the wrong side of the war, or wrong side of the border when the war ended. In 1917, you've got the fall of the Tsar's government in Russia and the beginning of 70 years of anti-religious communist rule in Russia, which obviously ended during our lifetimes with the fall of Soviet communism. But for basically 70 years, the Russian Orthodox Church will get stomped on by the communist government. The sad thing, of course, now is that the Russian Orthodox Church is under the thumb of Vladimir Putin right now. So they're not in much better spot. But this is a big change. The second Rome, Constantinople, is denuded of its Christian population in 1955. The third Rome, Moscow, by the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Orthodoxy is radically weakened in relation to Protestantism and Catholicism by the 20th century, by war and the development of events. The twin threats of communism and fascism place a huge strain on the church trying to combat evil and not get itself killed. There were some heroes that stood against them, men like Dietrich Bonhoeffer or Karl Barth, but also some people that had compromises and made pacts with those forces, like the German Lutheran Church, which of course came back to haunt them and is looked at very shamefully to this day. For example, in the 1930s in the Spanish Civil War, one diocese had 115 of its 240 priests killed in the war. Of course, the Nazis and their anti-Semitism, the blood libel, and the millions of people murdered. One thing that we have to reckon with and cannot overlook is that millions of quote-unquote Christians cooperated with the Nazis in finding Jews and sending them to the death camps, whether they were Germans or Poles or Austrians, right? Anne Frank died because her Christian neighbors turned her in. And that was repeated all over Europe. And so this is a massive stain on church history and something that is still being reckoned with, and the cost is moving forward in history. The fact that against communism and fascism, the church was not all that it could have been. So post-World War II, Christianity in Europe is weaker than any time since the Middle Ages. And you know this. But in the Americas and Africa and Asia, both Protestantism and Catholicism have been flourishing post-World War II in the grand scheme of things. So after World War II, the center of focus for Christianity is not Europe anymore. It was North America and to a lesser extent South America. And now, and we'll get to this in our last slides, it's actually shifting towards Africa and Asia statistically. Two movements to take note of. Number one is the rise of Pentecostalism, whether that's we've got the social gospel and liberal Protestantism, and many people already know about that, but you also have a massive rise of Pentecostalism after World War II. Whether that's the Word of Faith movement or the prosperity gospel, it is growing by leaps and bounds, especially in Catholic Latin America. These renewalist movements, whether you call them Pentecostal or charismatic or whatever, have gone from 62 million people worldwide in 1970 to 709 million in 2010. In other words, the charismatic Pentecostal, depending on exactly how you define it, has gone from 5% of all Christians to 25% in 50 years. So that's a big development. With Catholicism, you've got Vatican II, and this is massively important. 1962, 2,000 bishops representing the world show up for this. Only less than half of them are from Europe. That shift is already happening, all right? One of the things that they did was promote the vernacular liturgy. In other words, no more Latin Mass. And now the priest is actually going to look at the people and not just face the altar and talk away from them. It's a huge change. Old-timers that remember the way it was, which again, it's 1962. It's been a while now. I shouldn't say too much old-timers because it's too close to when I was born. People in their middle ages that remember that. Also, however, there is an openness to ecumenism after Vatican II. Official statements saying maybe the Protestants aren't the children of the devil anymore, right? Maybe, and actually, literally, I make a joke, acknowledging that the Spirit of God is working in the Protestant church too. And so we're starting in that direction. Other things of note in the last century are, of course, work against poverty and work in favor of racial reconciliation. In the third world, especially Latin America, you have Christianity melded with socialist ideology, or at least anti-capitalist ideology, and you can understand why they weren't too pro-capitalist, because things had not gone well for the poor people there, resulting in what we know as liberation theology. That's a big tent, but that's the term you're here for it. Eventually, Pope John Paul II will talk about the preferential option for the poor in the mission of the church. And so there's this strain, especially in Central and South America, especially in Catholicism, of emphasizing the need to work with the poor and for the poor. Christianity will be embraced in Africa. In 1914, there were 4 million Christians in Africa. In 1950, 75 million. In 1970, 140 million. And by 2020, which now is in the past, it was in the future when I wrote this, 630 million. So from 1914 to 2020, you go from 4 million to 630 million in Africa. Now, some of that is the explosive growth of the population of Africa, but the percentage is climbing rapidly. You have the fight against apartheid in South Africa, which sadly the South African Dutch Reformed Church was in favor, was fighting against it, but they were opposed by the South African Dutch Reformed Church was maintaining apartheid. The African National Congress, led by Desmond Tutu, were fighting against it. That was a sad Christian-on-Christian kind of thing, much like in the Civil War in America, with people supporting slavery on the other side. And then lastly, of course, you have the Civil Rights Movement in the United States of America, which draws upon Catholic and Protestant and Jewish and other support of clergy and lay people marching with those fighting against that racial injustice. All right. What about the 21st century? Where are we at? This is the last slide, and then we've got just a couple of maps to wrap it up. In 1900, and this I talked about orthodoxy, 21% of the world's Christians were Orthodox. Now it's 11%. Roman Catholics have gone from 48 to 52, so not a dramatic shift, meaning that other and Protestant is 37%. In China and India, Christians are estimated at 120 million people. That's 6% of the world's population when this statistics came out. If they were their own religion, the Christians in India and China would be the 5th largest religion in the world. So the math doesn't make sense until you start putting it in stuff like that, right? As of 2009, there were more than 2 billion Christians in the world, 4 times as many as 1900, roughly a third of the world's population, 500 million more than Islam. Let me read you this quote from the Center for the Study of Global Christianity. It says this: in 1970, nearly 82% of the world's population was religious. By 2010, this had grown to around 88%, with a projected increase to almost 90% by 2020. Religious adherence is growing largely due to the continuing resurgence of religion in China. Of course, the Chinese government are trying to stop that. In addition, in 1970, Christianity and Islam represented 48% of the global population. By 2020, they will represent 57%. The global north is becoming more religiously diverse, with more countries becoming home to a greater number of the world's religions. However, religious diversity is decreasing in many countries in the global south, with the growth of mainly one religion, whether Christianity or Islam, as the reason. So were you under the impression that the world is less religious today than it was 50 years ago? You're wrong. That's a European phenomenon, and now to an extent an American phenomenon, but that is not a global phenomenon when you look at the statistics. That is just not true, because people in the global south, in Africa and Asia, are becoming more religious, and Christianity and to an extent Islam as well are growing there. The 20th century experienced the great shift of Christianity to the global south, a trend that will continue into the future. In 1970, 41% of all Christians were from Africa, Asia, or Latin America. By 2020, just 2 years ago, it's 64%. Between 1970 and 2020, each of the 6 major Christian traditions is expected to grow more rapidly than the general population in the global south. Simultaneously, Christianity is declining as a percentage of the population in the global north. So while we have experienced decreases of Christianity in Europe and North America, it is more than made up for in raw numbers in the south, in Africa and Asia especially. Couple of other statistics. The percentage of non-Christian religious people who have personal contact with a Christian. In other words, if you are not a Christian, do you know one? In North America, 40% of the people say yes. In Europe, 20%. In Africa, 24%. In Asia, 10%. In North Africa, Islamic countries, it's only 10%. All right, let me just give you a couple of maps and we'll wrap it up with this because our time is up. This is the world's religions by population chart. You see in North and South America, mostly Christian, right? But the size of the circle matters. Look at the size of the circle for India and the size of the circle for China. That's comparatively how many people live there. So that slice of Christianity in India, it's a lot of people. And that slice in China is a lot of people. All right? And then here you see the divide in Africa with the southern part of Africa now mostly Christian, the north mostly Muslim. And yes, this slice of gray, which is the non, right, the agnostic or atheist, it's growing in Europe and in America, but it's still a minority. But these are the numbers that are shifting, Africa and Asia. And while Christianity is definitely a minority in China and India, there are a lot of people just the same. Let's look at it this way. This is the religions of the world religions of the United States from 2010 to 2050. Obviously, this is a projection. We don't know. We're going from 78 to 66. 30 years from now, the projection is there'll still be more than half of the country is Christian. That's not the way people talk, is it? They talk like we'll be 5% of the population in 50 years. It's ridiculous. That has no basis in reality. And I often see hear people talking about how the Muslims are coming and they're going to institute Sharia law in America. Really? By 2050, they're only going to be 2% of the population. That's not happening, people. Buddhists, 1%. Hindus, 1%. Things are not changing as dramatically in America as they would have you think. And then this is the last one. This is a fascinating chart. I would encourage you to look at it on my blog and look at it later. This is the world as 100 Christians. If we divide the world's Christians by 100, 47 are Catholic, 22 are Protestant, 15 independent, 11 Orthodox. So that's how it works. 26 of them would be under 15 years of age, a quarter. More than half less than 64 years of age. 65 out of that 100 would be urban cities, right? Especially in Africa and Asia. 55 out of 100 would be living in a place with low inequality. There's some other ones that are important here. 26 out of 100 in Africa, 24 out of 100 in Latin America. North America is only 11 out of 100. Of the world's Christians, only about 1 in 10 live in North America. We don't think that way because we're Americans and American culture is so pervasive. In our minds, we probably think that American Christians are like a third or a quarter or something like that. It's only 10%. And that number is rapidly going down because of the explosive growth in Latin America, or excuse me, in Africa and Asia. Notice, 50 out of 100 don't speak one of the major languages. They don't speak English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, German. Half of them speak another language. A lot of that's Indian languages and Chinese. 89 out of 100 are literate. This is just a fascinating chart because it shows us that when you look at the church in the world today, it doesn't look like you and it doesn't look like me. We are the minority in the church in the world today. Rich, white, North American. Because the majority of the church is people of color, lower income, and global South is the term for South America, Africa, and Asia. So, all right, let's stop it there. We're already 3 minutes over. Questions? We flew through that, but the Reformation one always takes me longer than it should to get through.
A while back, did you mention a first, second, and third Rome?
Well, Rome is Rome. Second Rome is Constantinople. It's known as the Second Rome, right? Because of the Eastern Empire and the fall of Rome. So for 1,000 years, Constantinople was the head of Eastern Orthodoxy. But of course, there are very few Christians in Constantinople today. And then the Third Rome, the Russian Orthodox Church out of Moscow, but when the Bolsheviks came in, they crushed them. So that just helps explain why Orthodoxy has just taken a huge blow in the last 100 years. The politics and the war and all of that have been very rough. Behind the Iron Curtain for 70 years, dealing with the Turkish government as well. So just some struggles there. Questions? Yes.
Very specific. What was the impetus for Lutheranism moving from Germany into Norway?
To Scandinavia?
Yeah.
Part of it is cultural ties and all of the trade and all of the cultural connections across the Baltic. There's a lot of connections between the people on both sides of the Baltic Sea, going back centuries. So I would imagine that had a lot to do with it.
There's also a Viking under.
Sure, yeah, the common Viking heritage, the Hanseatic League. There's a bunch of stuff going back. It made a lot of sense that something that took root in the Northern German, especially the Northern German, right? Northern Germany is very akin to Scandinavia. Southern Germany, that Austrian, Bavarian culture is quite different. We think of Germany as one thing, but they're quite different, north to south. So it's not a surprise that they would find a connection to the Scandinavians.
Makes me think of when Christ came, they had the Roman roads.
Yeah. Trade routes, cultural connections, all of that kind of stuff. Yep, and of course there was a strong connection between the Germans and the English at this point because of the relatives of the monarchs. Of the Hanoverian, which one is it? Hanoverian dynasty. Yes, that one. All right, let's wrap it up. We'll call it quits there. Thank you for coming. And that's about as much church history as we can get in 6 hours.